If you'll turn with me in your Bibles to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, we're going to read about 12 verses there, kind of set the scene and open this up and see what it's all about. Mark chapter 6, and we'll begin with verse 34. Here it says, "When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. 'This is a remote place,' they said, 'and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy them something to eat.' But Jesus answered, 'You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'That would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?' 'How many loaves do you have?' he asked. 'Go and see.' When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Now, as I look out into this, your bright, smiling, beautiful faces, I'm thinking there are probably, I don't know, maybe 80 to 100 people here today. You know, I'm going to go with 100 because that's just what preachers do, right? They go with a higher number. And we've got plenty of elbow room here, unless somebody gets wild with their elbows. But think about this. Think about if we added, say, 50 people to this room. And if there are 50 more people in here, I think we're going to say, we've got a crowd here. And it would kind of feel like we don't have a seat in the house. But let's imagine that we're going to fill up the room where it's standing room only. How many people, sitting and standing, could we get in this room? Could we get 300 maybe? Maybe 400 or 500, although I think that we would be very cramped if there was 400 or 500 people in this room. But let's think a little bigger than that. Let's think about going out into our parking lot out here and we start bringing people in. How many people could we get into that parking lot? Not really pressed against each other, but you know, a full number of people, but still comfortable. Maybe we could get 800, maybe 1,000 people, possibly. How much room would we need to get 5,000 people in one place, like we read about in this story? Except Mark points out here, and the other gospel writers do too, that they're only counting the men. That doesn't count the women and the children who were there. How about being in a crowd, in a church setting with more than possibly 10,000 people gathered together? Imagine how big of a space. Imagine how far from our parking lot into the downtown area we would have to go if we had 10,000 people gathered. And everyone there to hear the one man called Jesus. This right here is one of the best known of Jesus' miracles. Jesus taking these 5 little loaves, barely bigger than a breadstick each, and 2 probably dried fish. Really, it was lunch for one family, and feeding thousands, and then taking up 12 baskets full at the end when they only had 1 basket full to start with. Here was Jesus feeling for them. It says he had compassion for them, and then taking the time to teach them the truth, and then giving them all a share of manna from heaven in the form of this basket of food. And so Jesus met their needs emotionally, and he met their needs spiritually, and he met their needs even physically. And we get that from this story. We've heard it many, many times. It's been taught to us. It's been preached about. You tell your kids this story. And it tells us who Jesus really is. And it tells us what he felt about people. And it tells how he ministered to people. And we learn from this story and in many others that Jesus is the most selfless person we'll ever know or read about. He never, ever considered his time his own. He was at the ready for people. Whatever they needed, Jesus was ready to provide, and Jesus was able to provide. When Jesus is there, there's always enough for everyone. And we need to remember that we're a lot like that crowd of people in need of being taught, in need of being fed. And so when we come together and open this book, or any time that we open this book, we need to be humble about that. We need to be like Samuel who says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And Jesus will meet your needs emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And speaking of the crowd, there's something amazing here in this story, because we learn that Jesus was on the northwest bank of the Sea of Galilee, possibly in Capernaum, and so many people were coming and interrupting Jesus and his disciples that it says in the text they didn't even have a chance to eat. And so Jesus at some point gets up with his disciples and invites them to go to the dock, and they get into a boat and they leave. So there was a crowd standing, probably followed them out, and they were standing at water's edge, and they see Jesus and his disciples begin to sail across the lake. And in a few minutes, they begin to realize that they are pretty sure where he's going. And so Jesus and his disciples are crossing the lake in their boat from Capernaum on the west side to the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, a distance by land of about 12 miles. And so Mark 6 and verse 33 says, "Many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them." So here was Jesus and his disciples taking this 2 or 3 or 4 hour boat ride. We don't know exactly how long. And notice this, that the people were running after them. They were watching him from land and maybe guessing that he was going to dock in Bethsaida. And so the people got there first on foot. I can imagine as the front runners were running through the streets of the villages, people were stopping and asking what's going on, and all they would have to say, "It's Jesus." And with each village, more people drop whatever they're doing and they start down that road in a jog and in a run. And what started with just maybe a few who saw Jesus and the disciples set sail grew to 20, and then 30, and then 50, and then 100, and 300 and 500 and 1,000, and then there's 2,000, and then there's 3,000 and 5,000. And then there were the women and children too who weren't part of the count. What was it about Jesus that caused people to drop what they were doing, to pick up and go and forget about their next meal or where they were going to be when the sun went down and it wasn't safe to travel home alone? I wonder what it is that we could learn from this crowd. That Jesus is just that valuable to people, to us, and that we ought to be willing to drop everything to find out what he's got in mind for us. So much so that you forget about lunch. Have you thought about lunch this morning? Be honest. They so didn't think about lunch, they didn't bring it with them. They didn't bring any food with them. Nobody was thinking about food. Out of 10,000 or so, one boy brought something to eat because everybody was focused on Jesus for the answers to life. They weren't living by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of Jesus. So don't forget, what he's got is worth dropping everything you consider to be important to your life. What he's got is worth missing lunch, missing out on a business opportunity, or missing a football game, or missing a trip to the beach. Just make sure that he's that important to you. And I think that he is. Because when I think about you, I see a lot of reverence and respect and love for Jesus. And it feels real to me when I talk with you. Not that we've arrived as disciples. I think we've got a long way to go to show that we can be as selfless as he has called us to be. But I know the belief is there. That Jesus is real to you, that you consider him your Lord. And so this is where we've got to start, to be willing, to be open to put this first, and to act on the belief that he is enough for everyone. And so we get this picture of Jesus from this story, and it's a true story. We get a little bit of an idea also of what the crowd was thinking and hoping as they found themselves running to Jesus. But there's another group in this account that's worth a closer look. And I really think that the gospel writers who wrote this many years after it happened, and by the way, all four of the gospel writers tell this account, which is kind of rare. There's only a few stories where all four of them tell it. But they wrote it many years after it happened, when the church was still young and maybe unsure of itself. And I think the gospel writers needed the church to see what happens here with the disciples. Because up to this point, the disciples, the 12, were just followers of Jesus. Now they were chosen by him, and they spent time with him constantly. Jesus was having them baptize people, and so they assisted Jesus in many things, but they didn't teach. And they certainly didn't work miracles. The disciples were just learning, sometimes astonished and even disbelieving of what they were learning, but they were in a very submissive role. But something changes. From the beginning of Mark chapter 6, we read that Jesus goes to his hometown and he experiences pointed rejection of him, which causes him to say that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and among his own family. And I wonder if that rejection served as kind of a wake-up call, that if Jesus didn't already know it, it was the warning sign that his time was short, that rejection of him would grow and spread. And why would it? Because people didn't want to hear what Jesus was saying. They wanted a conqueror, not a savior. So at this point, Jesus steps up his work. And from Mark 6 and verse 6, he not only starts hitting all of the villages with his message, but it also says there that he pairs up his 12 disciples and he gives them authority to teach and to work miracles. And so the disciples at this point get a promotion. Now they're doing the important stuff. And they go out and preach that people need to change. And they find themselves healing the sick. And they find themselves driving out the demons. The things that only Jesus did up to this point. And now they were doing these things as well. Doing things that exceeded what the teachers of the law and the Pharisees could do. Now people were starting to notice them and be in awe of them. And so from verse 30 of Mark 6, the disciples came back and they can't wait to tell Jesus all about it. And Jesus wanted to hear what they had experienced. But then there were the people that kept coming from everywhere. They kept interrupting the disciples. They were trying to tell their experiences, and they got all these interruptions, and even their meal was being interrupted. And finally, Jesus says, here's what we've got to do. We've got to go someplace quiet and get some rest. And so finally, a break from all this. And they get into the boat. And they pull away from the shore, and they're watching the people behind them get smaller and smaller. And I wonder if they were saying some nasty things about all the needy people who wouldn't leave them alone. Kind of like we sometimes find ourselves saying. Because they had important stuff to tell Jesus. They were teachers now and miracle workers. And Jesus wanted to hear everything. So on the one side of the lake were all these constant interruptions, and on the other side was going to be their time. That their expectations of what was going to happen were finally going to be met. Except that when they neared the shore, there were all of the people on the shore, waiting for them. And I'm guessing, again, that the disciples kind of reacted out loud, I'm thinking, with groans and complaints. And maybe Peter said something like, turn south before they see us. And maybe they're about to, when Jesus says, no, they're sheep without a shepherd. And maybe they hang their heads in shame a little bit, but with great reluctance, their private outing spoiled by people, they land at shore. And I wonder if maybe the disciples act kind of distant, resentful, feeling like the people are just using Jesus to get what they want, looking for a miracle. And they had experienced that firsthand, no doubt. So they come to the end of the day, and the disciples' patience is wearing thin, and they go to Jesus and ask him to tell them to go away. The day's over, they say. The people haven't eaten all day. Tell them to run along and fend for themselves because we're tired. We've been doing the important work. We need peace and quiet. Instead, Jesus says, you feed them. You give them something to eat. And I imagine that was a very awkward moment. And they begin to offer up excuses. And the first one is the one that we always use. We can't afford it. It's too expensive. Whew, we got out of that one. Now can we dismiss them? And then Jesus asks, well, what food do we have on hand? Go find out. And they're scrambling, maybe confused and even angry. They've done their duties. They've spent all day with these people, and now they've got to feed them too. They come back thinking they're about to get out of this because they only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Guess we'll have to tell them to go away. Instead, Jesus has the disciples tell the people to sit in groups on the grass, and the disciples suddenly find themselves doing servants' work again, assisting Jesus in all the grunt work, probably more resentful than ever. At least that's what I take from this. I think Jesus was really frustrated with them. In fact, after they took up the leftovers, verse 45 says that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on without him. Wait, what? This was supposed to be their trip. And Jesus is telling them to go away while he goes up on the mountainside to pray for patience, I think. And what Mark tells next in Mark 6 is how Jesus came to them during the night while they were on the lake, and Jesus came to them walking on the water. And Mark points out here in verse 51 that this completely mystifies them, Jesus walking on water. And he tells why. He says, because they had not understood about the loaves. And verse 52 says, their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were hardened. There's where it is right there. The resentment and the anger and so focused on getting out of the situation that they had totally missed the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And I think Mark and the other gospel writers in recording this were telling the church, don't get so wrapped up in your own importance that you forget we've been called to serve. Even when people are bugging you for help, even when it feels like they're taking advantage of you, even when you think that you don't have the money, even when you're in great need of some rest, you feed them. And Christ will make sure there is enough for everyone, even for you. And so, church, let's never forget why we're here and why we're a part of this. He put us here in this place, in this area, with this group of people for a reason. And I don't necessarily know what the reason is. Neither do you. We're simply called to humble ourselves before Him and before each other. Listen to Him and follow His lead. There is enough for everyone when it comes to Jesus, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. Let Jesus feed your soul. Let him fill you up. Come to him today. We're here to help you in any way. So come now as we stand and sing.